Imagine marching for weeks across a ruined continent, fighting in frozen forests and burned-out cities, only to be captured, exhausted, filthy, half-starved, and then handed a plate piled high with steak and eggs. You'd think it was a trick. Many German soldiers did. They looked at the food, at the grinning American cook behind the counter, and whispered to each other that this had to be some kind of mind game. Because in their world, prisoners were starved, humiliated, and beaten. But in America, the prisoners were eating better than some civilians back home. For a lot of captured German soldiers in 1944 and 1945, that first meal in an American POW camp was their first taste of real confusion. They expected revenge. They got hospitality. The steak wasn't the only thing that stunned them. It was the dignity of it all. The clean uniforms, the music playing somewhere in the distance, the sight of guards who didn't scream orders or raise their rifles without cause. It felt wrong. It felt like weakness. And yet, it was deliberate. America had captured hundreds of thousands of German soldiers, men who, days earlier, had been shooting at them across rivers and fields. The U.S. didn't have the luxury of vengeance. They had a bigger plan: feed them, treat them humanely, and watch what happens. Because food is never just food, it's psychology, power, and propaganda, all on the same plate. At first, those German prisoners refused to believe it. Some wouldn't even touch the meals. They thought it was poisoned, or that it was meant to soften them up before interrogation. But hunger is stronger than suspicion. Slowly, they began to eat, and the first bites often brought tears, not because the food was delicious, but because it reminded them of home. Of Sunday mornings when their mothers fried eggs in butter before the world turned to ash. The taste of normalcy, of something gentle, in a war built entirely on cruelty, broke something inside them. And that's what the Americans understood better than anyone. When you treat a man like a beast, he becomes one. But when you treat him like a man, he's forced to remember he has a conscience. These POW camps were spread all across America, from the farmlands of Texas to the forests of Wisconsin. Each camp was run under the Geneva Convention, meaning prisoners were entitled to decent food, shelter, and medical care. But decent barely describes it. For German soldiers used to thin soup and stale bread, the U.S. rations looked like luxury. There were eggs, bacon, fresh bread, even coffee, real coffee, not the burnt barley substitute they'd been choking down in Europe. And for many of them, this wasn't just about survival, it was an identity crisis. They had been told America was decadent, morally bankrupt, run by greedy merchants and weak men. Nazi propaganda painted Americans as mongrels, incapable of sacrifice or discipline. Yet here they were, being fed like kings by the very enemy they were told was subhuman. It made them question everything they'd believed. Some POWs later admitted that the first crack in their loyalty to the Reich didn't come from bombs or battles, but from breakfast. They couldn't reconcile the image of the brutal, corrupt America they'd been taught with the quiet kindness they experienced in those camps. But there was another layer to it. The Americans weren't just being generous, they were strategic. Feeding the enemy well wasn't just charity. It was information warfare. Because every satisfied prisoner was a story waiting to be told. When these men were repatriated after the war, they'd return to a shattered Germany and tell people about what they'd seen, about the America that treated them with respect, that gave them steak and eggs instead of punishment. It was the best propaganda money couldn't buy. And the U.S. knew it. Inside the camps, this policy went even further. German prisoners were paid small wages for their labor, could write letters home, and were encouraged to attend classes, English lessons, history, even democratic philosophy. It was re-education, but not in the crude, forced sense. It was subtle. They were shown, not told, that there was another way to live, a way without fear or hierarchy or fanaticism. That idea grew quietly, meal after meal, lesson after lesson. One American officer described it like this: "You can't argue a man out of hate, but you can feed it out of him." And that's exactly what happened. For many Germans, the experience of captivity in America became a strange kind of moral awakening. Still, not all of them accepted it easily. Some officers tried to maintain strict military discipline inside the camps, holding secret Nazi meetings, organizing resistance, even punishing those who showed weakness by cooperating. They saw the good treatment as a test of loyalty. If you enjoyed it, you were betraying the fatherland. But over time, even the most stubborn ideologues began to break down. You can only watch your comrades laugh, play baseball, and eat full meals for so long before you start to question why you're still angry. The turning point for many came during Christmas of 1944. Across dozens of camps, American guards decorated trees, played carols, and invited POWs to join in. Some of those Germans hadn't seen a Christmas tree since before the war. They wept openly. One German corporal later wrote that it was the first time I realized the war was truly over, not because I had surrendered, but because they had forgiven. And that's the strange paradox of it all. While Europe was still burning, America was quietly winning the peace. Not through force, but through small acts of humanity. Every steak, every egg, every letter home was a psychological seed planted in the hearts of men who'd once marched under the swastika. When the war finally ended, thousands of these POWs didn't want to go back. They'd tasted something they couldn't forget, freedom that didn't need to prove itself through violence. Many tried to stay in America, and those who did return to Germany often became the quiet backbone of its democratic rebirth. They had lived the difference between tyranny and decency, and they carried that memory like a scar and a compass. What's even more remarkable is how these stories stayed hidden for decades. The world wanted tales of heroism, not of prisoners eating well. But for the men who lived it, that contradiction, being defeated yet respected, became the most unforgettable part of their war. And if you think about it, that was America's ultimate act of power. Not revenge, not dominance, but restraint. To feed the enemy when you could have starved him. To offer comfort when hatred would have been easier. It's a kind of strength that dictators never understand, because it's built on something deeper than fear. Some of those German prisoners would later say that the greatest shock of their captivity wasn't the defeat, it was the kindness. Because kindness, after you've been raised on cruelty, feels like confrontation. It exposes everything rotten you once believed. It forces you to look at your own humanity again and realize how far you'd strayed from it. And maybe that's the quiet genius behind it all. By feeding their enemies, America didn't just fill their stomachs, they planted doubt in their ideology, humility in their pride, and humanity in their hate. They didn't understand it at the time, but that plate of steak and eggs was never just a meal. It was a message, a quiet one. The kind that doesn't need to shout to change the world. For many German prisoners, that message didn't fully sink in until they started to see what life in America actually looked like beyond the barbed wire. They'd be sent out to work on farms or in lumber yards, guarded only lightly, sometimes not at all. And what shocked them most wasn't the freedom they were given, but the trust. Farmers would hand them tools, even let them drive tractors, and treat them as workers, not captives. Imagine that, just weeks after being captured, a man who'd fought for Hitler's army was standing in a Kansas wheat field, helping an American family bring in the harvest. The guards didn't have to yell. There was mutual understanding. At first, the Germans didn't know how to respond to this kind of treatment. Some tried to act cold, distant, holding on to the discipline drilled into them. But the human mind isn't built for constant hostility. One farmer's wife might offer them lemonade on a hot day. Another might hand them extra bread to take back to camp. Slowly, the wall cracked. And with each act of kindness, the propaganda that had defined their lives began to crumble. One prisoner later recalled watching a little American girl wave at him as he returned to camp. He said, "It was the first time I realized I had been lied to. They told us these people were monsters." But she smiled. It sounds small, but that was the entire power of America's approach, the soft power of decency. The same force that fed them steak and eggs was now showing them that morality wasn't a weakness. It was strength. You have to remember, these weren't naive men. Many of them had seen atrocities. Some had even committed them. They'd marched through conquered lands, seen civilians starve, watched prisoners executed without remorse. And now they were standing in a place where even the enemy treated them better than their own regime had treated its allies. That contradiction created something deeper than gratitude. It created guilt. Quiet, unbearable guilt. Letters from the time show how conflicted they were. One soldier wrote to his wife in Germany, saying, "I am ashamed to tell you that I eat meat every day while you stand in line for bread. The Americans treat us not as enemies, but as guests." That sentence alone, as guests, tells you how upside down their world had become. Back home, propaganda still shouted about the cruelty of the Allies. Yet inside America, the men who had fought for Hitler were learning about democracy from their captors. The U.S. had realized something crucial. If you want to dismantle an ideology, you don't do it by starving people or screaming slogans. You do it by letting them see a better life with their own eyes. So they showed them. Libraries were opened in the camps. Classes were organized. Some POWs learned English. Others studied engineering, literature, even philosophy. They were encouraged to discuss politics openly, something unheard of in Nazi Germany. And bit by bit, these camps became microcosms of a free society. Of course, not everyone approved. There were Americans who felt it was wrong. Why should killers eat steak when soldiers were still dying overseas? Families who'd lost sons wrote angry letters demanding harsher treatment. But military officials stood firm. They argued that following the Geneva Convention wasn't just morality, it was strategy. Because how you treat prisoners is how your own men will be treated if captured. And beyond that, every humane act toward a German soldier was another victory in the psychological war for the future of Europe. Meanwhile, for the Germans, time inside those camps became a strange sort of mirror. Away from Hitler's speeches, away from Gestapo surveillance, they began to think freely again. Some started questioning why they'd ever believed in the Reich at all. They saw Black American guards, Mexican American cooks, Jewish officers, and realized that the inferior races they'd been taught to despise were treating them better than their so-called Aryan brothers had. That truth was impossible to ignore. There's a haunting story from a camp in Louisiana. A group of German officers refused to eat because a Black American cook had prepared their meal. The American officer in charge didn't punish them. He simply said, "You'll eat when you're hungry enough." 3 days later they broke, and when they did, one of them quietly apologized. That moment, 3 days of pride collapsing under the weight of hunger, became symbolic. The ideology of superiority doesn't survive long when you're staring at the man you once called inferior, handing you food that keeps you alive. As months turned into years, some camps even began hosting friendly competitions, soccer games between guards and prisoners, art exhibitions, small orchestras. The Germans who were musicians or painters found themselves encouraged to create again. One camp published its own newspaper, written entirely by POWs. It included essays about democracy, reflections on guilt, and stories of daily life behind the fences. Some of these writings would later be collected after the war and studied as examples of moral rehabilitation through humane captivity. But what really stuck with most men wasn't the books or the lessons, it was the ordinary decency of everyday life. The meals, the laughter, the silence at sunset. In a world that had collapsed into chaos, America had created small islands of normalcy, and that normalcy healed something inside them. When they were finally sent home, the re-entry was painful. They stepped off ships into a Germany that was rubble, cities flattened, families gone, children starving. Many wrote back to the Americans they'd met, sending letters filled with longing and disbelief. One wrote, "I am free, but I feel more like a prisoner here than I ever did there." Another said, "You gave us food, but more than that, you gave us a future we didn't deserve." Some of those men would become mayors, teachers, even diplomats in post-war West Germany. They carried with them the strange memory of being defeated by an enemy who refused to hate them, and that memory shaped how they rebuilt their nation. It's why, in the decades that followed, Germany became one of America's closest allies, not just politically, but emotionally. Because those men had lived the difference between cruelty and compassion, and they chose compassion. There's a quiet power in that kind of victory. It doesn't roar like a bomb or march in a parade. It lingers in memory, reshaping hearts long after the fighting stops. The German POWs didn't understand at first why America was feeding them steak and eggs. But eventually, they did. They saw that power doesn't always need to dominate. It can lead by example. And maybe that's what makes this story so hauntingly beautiful. In a war defined by destruction, one of the most transformative battles was fought not with bullets, but with breakfast. By 1945, the United States was home to nearly 500,000 German prisoners of war. They were scattered across more than 500 camps, from the pine forests of Alabama to the cornfields of Iowa. Each camp had its own rhythms, the clang of the mess hall bell, the hum of trucks bringing supplies, the occasional sound of a record player spinning swing music across the yard. But beneath that routine, something profound was happening. The war that had begun with hatred was quietly ending with empathy. When the prisoners first arrived, many expected the kind of brutality they themselves had seen inflicted on Soviet POWs. In the East, captivity meant starvation, frostbite, and execution. But in America, they found warm meals, clean barracks, and even medical care that rivaled what many civilians in Europe were receiving. The contrast was staggering. German doctors in the camps would later admit that U.S. Army surgeons treated wounded prisoners with the same precision and care as they did American soldiers. It was bewildering and for some, humiliating. But for most, it was deeply humanizing. They weren't forced to kneel before guards or shout slogans. There were rules, of course, roll calls, curfews, boundaries, but the tone was firm, not cruel. That distinction mattered. It taught men who had been raised on blind obedience that authority could exist without fear. Some even began to respect their captors, not for their strength, but for their restraint. One German sergeant wrote, "The Americans could crush us with power, but instead they control us with calm." That is something the Reich never understood. Inside the dining halls, food became the great equalizer. It wasn't gourmet. Army rations were practical, standardized, but compared to the famine stalking Europe, it was paradise. Breakfasts of eggs, toast, and sometimes steak or bacon. Lunches with potatoes, beans, fruit, and dinners that included meat, milk, even dessert. For the first time in years, they ate until they were full. And that small act, fullness, became symbolic of something larger. It filled more than their stomachs. It filled the silence left by propaganda, the emptiness left by defeat. One POW described the moment he first bit into a piece of steak after being captured in France. "I tasted not the meat, but the mercy." He said he didn't cry when his unit surrendered, but he cried when the American cook told him, "Eat up, there's plenty more." That phrase, "plenty more," hit differently for men who had been rationing their souls for years. It wasn't long before camp life developed its own strange normalcy. The prisoners worked, harvesting crops, building roads, repairing fences. They earned small wages they could spend at camp canteens on cigarettes, chocolate, or soap. They received mail from home, though it often arrived months late. Some even fell in love through letters with local women who volunteered in camp libraries or hospitals. It wasn't uncommon for a POW to marry an American woman years later and settle in the United States permanently. The war had brought them across the ocean as enemies, but peace was quietly turning them into immigrants. Still, for all the kindness they experienced, there was guilt, sharp and persistent. Some prisoners refused the extra rations, saying it felt wrong to eat steak while their families were starving in bombed-out cities. Others tried to smuggle bread out of the camp kitchens and hide it in packages bound for home. They knew it would never make it. Mail was censored, but the gesture helped ease their conscience. They wanted to share even a piece of the abundance they'd been given. And for the American guards, this dynamic was equally strange. Many had lost brothers or friends in the war. They'd seen the aftermath of Nazi cruelty in Europe. Yet here they were, serving breakfast to the same men who had worn the uniforms of that regime. Some struggled with it, at least at first. But over time, the humanity of it all chipped away at bitterness. Guards began to see individuals, not monsters. They learned names, stories, jokes. And the prisoners, in turn, saw something they'd never seen before: power used gently. When victory in Europe was declared in May 1945, the camps didn't erupt in celebration. The Germans stood in silence, their emotions tangled between relief and shame. Some feared what awaited them at home. Others didn't want to leave at all. In fact, thousands requested to stay in the U.S. as farm laborers rather than return to the ruins of Germany. Of course, most were sent back. America couldn't keep them forever, but they went home changed. On the voyage back across the Atlantic, some POWs were given one last meal before disembarkation: steak and eggs. It had become tradition by then, not officially, but spiritually. The same meal that had greeted them when they arrived now sent them home. Many later wrote that it felt like closure, a symbol of what they had learned, that dignity doesn't belong to victors or vanquished, but to those who choose humanity even when they don't have to. Years later, when West Germany rebuilt itself into a democracy, historians traced part of its moral foundation back to those POW camps. The men who had eaten American rations and attended those quiet lectures about freedom carried those lessons into their adult lives. Some became teachers who told students about the enemy who fed us. Others entered politics, advocating for cooperation rather than conquest. The ripple effect of kindness spread through a generation that had once been raised on hate. One of the most moving testimonies came from a former prisoner named Hans, who had been captured in Normandy. Decades later, he visited Texas, where his old camp once stood. Standing in a field that had long been cleared, he said, "We thought we had lost the war, but this place showed us what we had truly lost: our humanity. And here, we found it again." That's the quiet legacy of America's POW policy. It didn't just win battles, it won minds. Not through punishment, but through patience. Not through humiliation, but through decency. The Germans came expecting chains and cruelty. They left with something they could never have imagined: respect for their captors, and the beginnings of respect for themselves. And maybe that's the lesson hidden beneath all the uniforms and flags, that how you treat your enemy says more about your strength than how you defeat him. America could have chosen vengeance. Instead, it chose dignity. And because of that, steak and eggs became something more than a meal. It became a quiet symbol of civilization, proof that even in a world consumed by war, humanity can still win. When those German POWs finally returned to their homeland, they stepped into a country that barely resembled the one they'd left behind. Cities were dust. Railways twisted like broken bones. People scavenged for coal and bread. And amid the ruins, those former soldiers, once proud, once indoctrinated, began to tell stories that no one expected to hear. Stories about America. About kindness. About steak and eggs. Neighbors didn't believe them at first. How could the enemy, the so-called decadent West, have treated prisoners better than their own government had treated its citizens? But the stories kept spreading, because they were true. And those stories carried power. In taverns, churches, and kitchens across Germany, men who'd eaten well in captivity shared what they had witnessed, An enemy who didn't humiliate them, who gave them books instead of beatings, who showed them what justice without cruelty looked like. Slowly, that image of America began to eclipse the caricature of moral decay the Nazis had drilled into their minds. For many of those men, re-entry was harder than captivity. They found wives who'd remarried, parents dead, and streets filled with hollow faces. They felt alien in their own land. But there was something else, an invisible inheritance from their time in the camps. They had seen order without oppression, strength without arrogance. That memory became a kind of quiet rebellion against the old way of thinking. They wanted to rebuild Germany, not as an empire, but as a society that could one day be worthy of the same respect they'd been given by their captors. Historians now say that the seeds of West Germany's post-war democracy were partly planted in those American camps. It wasn't the lectures or the leaflets that did it. It was the lived experience of fairness. One former officer described it perfectly. They defeated us with weapons, but they conquered us with decency. When he said that, he didn't mean humiliation. He meant transformation. To be treated as human by someone you were taught to hate forces you to question the architecture of your beliefs. It dismantles indoctrination, one small, quiet act at a time. Even decades later, when these men were old and gray, you could still hear the disbelief in their voices when they spoke about their first meal in captivity. Many of them remembered it in exact detail: the steam off the eggs, the smell of coffee, the way the steak glistened with butter. It wasn't just nostalgia, it was reverence. Because for them, that meal was the first time they realized that mercy could be stronger than violence. That the real victory of war isn't in destroying your enemy's body, but in changing his mind. One of the more haunting details came from letters sent home in 1946. After many had already been released, some prisoners wrote to American guards, thanking them by name. Others sent money, tiny amounts they had saved from their camp wages, to local churches or families near the camp as a gesture of gratitude. A few even emigrated to America years later, building quiet lives in the very country that had once been their enemy. They carried that paradox proudly: to be conquered but respected, defeated but humanized. What's remarkable is how invisible this story remained for so long. The great wars are remembered for their battles, their generals, their destruction, but rarely for the strange pockets of grace that existed in between. The story of German POWs eating steak and eggs doesn't fit the narrative of total war. It doesn't sound cinematic, but that's exactly what makes it powerful, because it reveals something most wars try to bury: that compassion can exist even in the heart of conflict, and that sometimes feeding your enemy is the most strategic thing you can do. The U.S. government didn't design this out of naivete. They understood that the world after 1945 would be shaped not just by victory, but by perception. Feeding German prisoners well wasn't just charity, it was diplomacy, before the peace treaties were even signed. When those men went home, they became witnesses, living proof that the American ideal wasn't propaganda, it was real enough to taste. And that's why, when the Cold War began, America already had something the Soviets never did: a generation of former enemies who could say, with first-hand certainty, that democracy didn't just talk about freedom, it practiced it. Over the years, researchers interviewed hundreds of those POWs. The pattern was always the same. They talked about the food first, then the fairness, then the confusion, then the change. It always started with the steak and eggs. Because that meal shattered their expectations, it forced them to reevaluate everything. If the enemy could be kind, then maybe the world wasn't as simple as they'd been told. Maybe loyalty to an ideology that glorified cruelty wasn't strength, it was blindness. One man summed it up best when he said, "They didn't make us love America. They made us see what love looked like." That's not a line from a movie, it's a line from a diary written by someone who had marched under Hitler's flag. Think about that. A man indoctrinated by years of fanaticism learned the meaning of love from his captors. And it started with a breakfast. It's easy to dismiss this as sentimental, to say that kindness doesn't win wars. But the truth is, wars never end when the guns fall silent, they end when hearts change. And in those camps, hearts did change. Not all at once, not completely, but enough. Enough to make Germany one of America's closest allies. Enough to prove that power without cruelty doesn't make you weak, it makes you unforgettable. So when you hear that German POWs didn't understand why Americans were feeding them steak and eggs, remember, it wasn't just a meal. It was a message written in salt, butter, and trust. A message that said, you can hate us, but we will not become you. And that's why it worked. Because the greatest form of strength isn't showing your enemy who you are, it's showing him what he could be. And in that quiet act, one plate at a time, America didn't just win the war, it won something far rarer, the respect of its enemies. The kind that doesn't fade with time, because it isn't built on fear. It's built on the simplest, strangest truth there is, that sometimes the most powerful weapon in the world is breakfast.